Hello. Welcome to the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show.
Welcome to a podcast show about stuff. It's the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Here's your host, Stephen Davis.
Hello. Get your official products such as this marvelous t-shirt that I'm wearing, or this great coffee mug that I'm drinking out of, and many other products with the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis logo at https://www.zazzle.com/store/a-stuff-store, and make sure you get your 15% discount today. Welcome to the premiere episode of the 4th season of the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. My guest today, I am in such awe at his accomplishments. Dr. Richard Allen Williams, born during a time of rampant and overt racism, met it head on to become one of the most respected cardiologists, not just in this country, but in the world. Dr. Williams secured a $3 million grant to establish the King Drew Sickle Cell Center at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital in LA. He founded the Association of Black Cardiologists in Atlanta and the Minority Health Institute, which takes on racism in the healthcare field. He was the 117th president of the National Medical Association, and he's done all this while being a world-renowned jazz trumpeter. Please welcome Dr. Richard Allen Williams. How are you today, Dr. Williams?
I'm just fine, Stephen. How are you?
Hey, I'm standing up on my own. Sometimes I have to use a cane every now and then.
Vertical, not horizontal, huh?
This is the best possible in terms of being here. And then for my excitement, I get to talk to you.
My goodness.
Usually what I do in this show is, this is a show about you, about your life, about accomplishments, about goals and things of that sort. Where I want to start at is, I know that you were born in Wilmington, Delaware.
Correct.
In 19...
Yeah, way back then.
But at that time, there were a lot of Blacks moving from the South to the North, but those that moved had kids that didn't come until the 40s, 50s, or whatever. So that there is a difference in terms of style of how you grew up. Tell us about, first of all, your parents. What were your parents' names?
My parents were named Mr. and Mrs. Walter Sinclair Williams. My mother's name was Mildred Williams.
Okay. And talk a little bit about them. First, your father.
My father was a rugged son of a gun. Came from Georgia, Vidalia, Georgia, and he came from there at the turn of the 20th century, somewhere around 1910 or so, when he was a mere boy, and he came ahead of the Ku Klux Klan, which chased his family out of that town and took away all their property, which they had accumulated, and made them have to leave town because of some racial incident that occurred there. between my family and some white folks there. Anyway, he and his family moved north from Georgia through the South, and they had pledged to not stop until they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, which is between Delaware and Maryland. And once they crossed that line into Wilmington, Delaware, that's where they stopped. And that's how I happened to be born there, because my father met my mother in Wilmington. She was from Maryland, a farmer's daughter, literally. And they hooked up, got married, and had 8 kids. I was the last of the children.
Now, you were lucky, weren't you?
I was very lucky because my mother had said she was going to stop at 7. I somehow slipped through the net. He always reminded me, boy, you're lucky to be here. Didn't intend for you to get through. Mom,
Uh,
I'm so grateful that you slipped up.
the part that so many blacks had to come north not because they were looking for a better life, but because they were ran out of town.
That's
My
exactly
grandfather
right.
was the same way. He and his siblings were walking down the road in South Carolina, and this car full of white folks almost hit them. And so he picked up a rock and threw at the car as it
Hmm.
was speeding away. And they told him, the powers that be in the town told him that he had to be out by sundown.
Exactly. That's what happened with my father.
Hmm.
They
And
had to pick up whatever they could and
so
run.
I understand that so very well. Um, you were born at a time where there's still racism in this country. We know that. But so much of it is now a little bit covert. It's there, but it's not as out in the open as it was at that particular time, because there's rules and regulations and laws that regulated how the relationships were between the races at that time. How was it growing up in Wilmington, Delaware?
Wilmington was considered a border town, and Delaware was considered a border state. What that meant was you were neither south nor north, southern or north, but you were somewhere in between. And as such, the laws or the regulations against racial fraternizing weren't so strict. When I say racial fraternizing, not just socializing, but living in the same neighborhoods and going to the same schools and so forth, except for the schools. Schools were strictly segregated, but neighborhoods were not necessarily that strictly segregated. We lived in a very poor neighborhood and with a lot of poor whites that shared that poverty with us, Italians and Polish people and Jewish people and so forth. So it was a mix at that time in Wilmington, Delaware. And we, as kids, didn't really perceive that we were being discriminated against because we didn't know there was a better life on the other side of the street, so to speak. We hardly ever went over on the other side, so to speak, and just continued to pursue our lives on our side in the best way that we possibly could.
During that time, did both or did one of your parents have the most influence on you?
I would say that my mother did because being the youngest child, it was always necessary for me to be very close to her for care and so on and so forth, except for when my older siblings took care of me when my mother had to go to work. And of course, my father was always working. But yeah, I was closer to my mother than I was to my father. My father wasn't around as much as my mother, of course, because he had to get out there and work to support 8 kids. And we were grateful that he did that. Otherwise, we would have been in serious trouble.
Okay. Now, did you remember your first experience in terms of school? Do you remember the first day that you went to school?
I remember before the first day I went to school, let me give you a little background leading up to that. Since I was the youngest kid in the family, I was often left home when the other kids were going to school. For instance, my next oldest sibling was 2 years older than I was, and she went to elementary school at the age of, I think it was 6. I was home at the age of 4, and all the others were going to school. So my mother said, we need to get you into some kind of school, mainly because she needed to have some freedom so she could work. And she found a kindergarten for me to attend, which was right up the street from us. And she put me into that kindergarten, and that really started my educational career off. That teacher, Mrs. Gray, took me under her wing, taught me everything that she knew, both from the educational standpoint and in life and so forth. She was just wonderful. And I learned so much from her and learned mainly the joy of learning, joy of education. And she taught me to read at the age of 4, so much so well that I started reading to my classmates in kindergarten. When they took recesses, she would tell me, Alan, go and read to your classmates because you can read and they can't. And I would choose these little stories to tell them very briefly. And so, anyway, we went on from there. When I turned 5, I had to do kindergarten all over again because I still was too young to go to school. You had to be 6. And I couldn't wait until I got to be 6. So I went back to kindergarten, but this time I got a chance to combine that with some trips to the local library. Um, my brothers and sisters used to take me there to the Wilmington Public Library, and they had a children's section. And since I could read, they let me check out books, and I would bring books home and read them. And I was well prepared when I turned 6 and was able to go to number 14, I think it was, school in Wilmington, elementary school. And so I was well prepared for that first day of school. The teachers said, we're going to teach you how to read. And I said, I already know how to read. And they said, oh, you show us. And she gave me a book and I read it. And she said, oh, way ahead of the game. So I remember that first day, because they were somewhat surprised, let us say, that I was already somewhat educated, pretty well educated for somebody entering the first grade. Sorry to take so long giving that story, but it was a very important time for me.
Story, great story. As a matter of fact, again, I refer in terms of my daughter, because when she was teaching, I think the first year that she was teaching, she was supposed to teach the 5th grade.
Uh-huh.
And at the last minute, they had it changed because of whatever union rules was, that there was somebody who came in and they had to take the 5th grade class and she had to take the 1st grade
Oh
class.
my goodness.
And she went to 1st grade class, she prepared, and she says, okay, I want you all to take out your books and read this. And then everybody looked at her like, excuse me. She realized, oh, y'all can't read. I'm supposed to teach you. Oh,
But
now,
that ability to read really stood me in good stead because I got a chance to read again to my classmates during the recesses and other times. And it put me ahead and put me at the head of the class, so much so that when the time came for promotion to the 2nd grade, they said, you don't need to go to the 2nd grade. We need to put you in the 3rd grade. So they skipped, like they used to call it, they skipped a grade for me. So I went from the 1st to the 3rd grade, and then I went from the 3rd to the 5th grade. And I was moving ahead pretty fast simply because of the fact that I'd gotten that early start in education, which I certainly think is an excellent thing for kids to be doing even now. So that put me way ahead of the time, so that by the time I was 14, I was ready to go to college. And that's when the people from Harvard came around and they started checking me out because they were looking for a student, a black student, to promote entry into Harvard. And they found me and they said, we'd like to interest you in going to Harvard. I didn't even know what Harvard was at that time. Anyway, I went along with it, and the Harvard Club of Delaware got behind the effort. And by the time that I was 16, I was admitted to Harvard.
Whoa. But before, I want to ask you some more questions in terms of that going forward, in terms of your experience at Harvard. But I want to know about your experience at Howard High School.
Yes.
How was it in terms of academically, socially at that particular school?
First of all, you have to understand that Howard High School was an all-black school. There were no, there was no integration in Delaware at that time of schools at all. So I went to black schools from K through 12, and that included Howard High School. So at Howard, I became like a, what you call it, but not a freak.
Nerd?
Yeah, I was nerdy, but uh, they looked at me as being unusual, let us say, because of the fact that I was so young in in high school and doing so well. I was already at the top of my class and graduated at the top. And they looked at me, hey, he's something different. So that's the way I was regarded. But I was fully included in the social activities and so forth to the extent that I wanted to participate. I wasn't really very interested in a lot of social stuff. I was interested in education and I wanted to move ahead and use whatever intellect I had to the best of my abilities.
So you live in Los Angeles now anyway. So they made Family Matters. They modeled Family Matters Steve Urkel after you, right?
I'm not so sure of that, but there's a close proximity, I guess you might say.
How did the kids feel towards you being older than you while you were in school? How did they feel?
They looked at me as I mentioned, as being a little bit different, but still they're classmates. And they showed great pride in what I was doing. And I think were pretty accepting of me in regards to a number of things that I did that they didn't do. For instance, very often I would get bored in the classes because I had already mastered, so to speak, all of the subject matter in those classes in sciences and in history and languages and so on and so forth that the other kids were still struggling with. So the teachers let me teach the classes. And I had fun with that. And they would look at me like, what are you doing? I said, teacher said that I can teach. And I did that several times in several different of the courses. So anyway, I was accepted, but looked at it as being a bit different, but they were proud of me and were proud to see what happened when I was admitted to Harvard at the age of 16 and going off to that.
How did your mother and father feel about you going to Harvard? Was there any trepidation about their baby going off to Harvard at 16?
No, they were proud and happy. The only concern that they had was whether or not there was going to be enough money available for me to be paid for at that expensive school. But that was taken care of. I got a full ride. All of my expenses and tuition, everything else were paid for. I made so much money going to Harvard that I actually sent money back to Skip back home. I had extra money I didn't need to use. So I made money. Uh,
Now, 16-year-old, still a boy, although I remember being 16 and people would call you boy, and I used to say, "Did you say Roy?"
yeah, I've heard that.
Going to Harvard as a black and 16 years old, how were you accepted?
At first, um, I was not really totally accepted. I was looked at again as being this sort of strange kid who came in at an early age. Even for Harvard, there were a lot of kids around who had come in at the age of 17 and so forth, but 16 was rare. We did later on have one kid who came in at the age of 15, but he wasn't black. My being black made me exceptional. And I was looked at as being, let's put it this way, there were different expectations of me. They thought, hey, he must be a genius, and we're expecting unusual things out of him. So they scrutinized my grades very closely. People who had nothing to do with my education wanted to know, what'd you get in this? What'd you get in that? And fortunately, I did very well. I was on the dean's list constantly, honors and so on and so forth. And I have one experience in particular that I'll never forget. I wanted to enroll in upper class courses when I was a freshman because I had already mastered some of the courses when I was in high school, the things that they look at now as honors courses that you take in high school and so forth. I'd already done essentially what was honors chemistry and physics and stuff like that. But um, there was one course in particular that I was very entranced with, and it was called experimental psychology. And the professor was a gentleman who's world famous named B.F. Skinner. Skinner was the guy who invented what was called the Skinner box, in which he advocated putting kids in and teaching and coming out with prodigies that had unusual abilities and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, I wanted to take Skinner's course just out of curiosity, but it was an upper class course. And being a freshman, I wasn't routinely allowed to do that. So I decided I would petition for the course. I found out that if you went to the professor and put in a petition for taking these upper class courses, they often sometimes would allow you to come in. So I petitioned Professor Skinner, and he looked at me like I had two heads. Little black boy from the ghetto who wants to come into my sophisticated class and thinks he can master it. So, but he let me in, I think more out of curiosity than anything else, just to see what I would be able to do. So I entered that class. And remember now, I'm only one of four black students at Harvard at that time out of 10,000 students. Okay. And so there was a lot of pressure and scrutiny. And so people were looking at me. I didn't even know that were looking at me. And so I entered the course, experimental psychology. To make a long story short, I aced the course. I got an A, and this was a year-long course. Professor Skinner saw my grades and decided he better find out what's going on with this little black boy. So he called me into his laboratory and said, I'm just very interested in you. I wanted to get to know you a little bit more. Can you tell me something more about yourself? And I told him, and he said, I'm just amazed that you're able to do so well in this upper class course. You've done much better than a lot of our senior students who are taking this course. How are you able to do it? I said, I'm just interested in your subject matter, and I work hard and study hard, and that's how I'm able. And I guess intelligence has a little bit to do with it. I think I have a gift for learning. So he said, oh, okay. And he said, continue to do well, and we wish you well. And that was it. I went on my merry way and continued on with my educational experiences through Harvard. There were several other very interesting ones, but somebody was always peeking over my shoulder or looking into my progress. I was considered sort of an experiment. I was an experiment at Harvard. A lot of folks were wondering, what can he handle it? Not only because he's so young, but because he's Black and didn't come from a pristine educational system like most of our white students did. And at one point, there was a who came to interview me from something called the Reporter magazine from New York. A lady named, a very famous lady at that time, named Maria Manas. And she announced that she had heard about me and wanted to write an article about me and so on and so forth. So she spent 2 days interviewing me and she wrote this article. I don't know what I did with it now, but it was very interesting and distributed nationally. And people were calling me and saying, we read about you and we didn't know all this stuff about you. And my classmates were amazed.
When you left Wilmington to go to Harvard, did the community get together to
No,
send you off?
no. My community, including my high school community, was too involved in trying to stay alive and survive. They didn't take much interest in somebody who, like myself, who was an exception to the rule that you were lucky enough to be able to go to high school and graduate, and you'd better just get out there and get a job and of some sort and try to stay alive and so on and so forth. They were more interested in just surviving rather than what I was doing. And it was nice to hear that I had this good fortune and so on and so forth, but they weren't really interested in it beyond that. At that time, when I came back after doing so well at Harvard, they had parties and receptions and all that kind of stuff. And I was a famous person there in the local hood.
I asked you that in remembrance of having a cousin that I'd never met because I wasn't born. She was an unusual person because she went to college back in the 1917 era.
Oh boy.
And that was unusual for a woman to go to college. And I think it was her senior year, she left to go back to finish up and I believe that she was going to Allen University in
Okay.
South Carolina. And they had a party for her in terms of going away. And at that particular period of time at the party, lightning struck and it struck her.
Oh,
And it was a community that had got together, pulled monies together to send her to college. And then that's what they used to do a lot of in the South. So that's why I asked you that particular question in terms of the support from the community.
so she was killed by the lightning?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Mhm.
How horrible.
Now, you go on to finish up at Harvard after going to all that you went in Harvard. What did you decide to do after you got your degree from Harvard? What was your thought process in terms of, okay, I am now, how old were you when you graduated from Harvard, excuse me.
20.
Okay, you're 20 years old, your degree, the world is your oyster. What do you do?
It wasn't as simple as that because I had already determined when I was 5 years old that I was going to be a doctor. And so this was all part of the process leading up to my going to medical school. It had already been predetermined and affirmed by my father that I was going to go to medical school. However, there was one thing that interfered with that process, and that was my interest in and involvement in music, in playing jazz, because I had been playing jazz ever since I was playing music ever since I was 8 years old, playing the trumpet. I think you had played the trumpet at one point too.
No, no.
Oh, no.
I couldn't even blow it. I
Oh,
tried
okay.
blowing it. I couldn't get a note out of it.
Nobody can initially. You just have to keep trying. Yeah.
I didn't have that much patience. If it didn't come out immediately, then it's time to go on to something else.
But in any event, I had become a pretty good trumpet player and had even had an experience in playing at a place they love in New York City, which is the Apollo Theater.
Okay.
I played at the Apollo when I was 14.
Whoa, whoa.
Yeah. And that was an experience. I had joined a big band. I've been allowed to join a big band in Philly, which is reasonably close to Wilmington, just 29 miles away. And they into the band. I was 13 at the time that I joined the band, and I had to be taken there with some of my older friends, musician friends. And we'd go there once a week to practice. And we attracted the attention of some other folks who invited us to perform at the Apollo. And I was really excited about it. And we went to the Apollo and performed. We didn't win, but we didn't get dragged off the stage either. You know how it is.
Especially when the people start jumping up and down and saying boo, boo.
Yeah, yeah. I'll never forget that experience playing at the Apollo. And interestingly, I met a young man at the Apollo when we were waiting to go on, who was down in the basement in the Apollo where musicians can warm up. And he was down there playing the piano and playing it so well. I said, "Who is that guy?" It turned out to be Earl Garner.
Oh, wow.
That kind of stuff that happened. So anyway, to get back to the story about what I decided to do when I got my degree from Harvard, I had already gotten admitted to medical school, but I wanted to play music, and I had been offered a place to play in Dizzy Gillespie's big band. And that was the band that had the horns, the trumpets that were tilted up, periscope trumpets. And I wanted to go and play music. My father said, "No, you got to go to medical school."
I knew you were going to say your father said,
Yeah.
hell no.
So I said, "Maybe you'll accept a compromise." He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "How about, since I've already gotten admitted to med school, I take a year off if they'll allow me to do that before going and play music, go out on the road and doing whatever I can playing. And if I decide that I like music better than going into medicine, then I'll continue to pursue my musical career. If not, then I'll go into medical school." He said, "That's okay. So you can take an off year and see what happens." And that's what I did. So I went out and played. I played with a number of great troops. I didn't join Dizzy Gillespie's group because he got another young man named Lee Morgan and played with a gentleman from New York that you might have heard of named Rasan Roland Kirk.
Oh, I sent out a Facebook about 2 weeks ago because they had a posting about people who have done live performances at the Village Vanguard.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And they named a few people. And then I wrote, I was at Rashawn Roland Kirk's performance in 1973, I think it was 1973 and 1976, when he did the three horns in his mouth. And they recorded it, and I didn't know. And then I found that performance and said, "Wow, I was at that performance."
See that? Yeah. You never know what's going to become famous. Yeah.
Yes.
He could play as many as six horns at one time.
Oh, he was fantastic. He was
Yeah,
fantastic.
he was. And such a wonderful guy. And of course, everybody knows that, I hope, that he was blind and
Yes.
all of that as a blind person, visually challenged. Anyway, I went out and played around for that year. I was so worn out trying to play at night and sleep during the day and moving around all around the place. Near the end of the year, I told my dad, I said, "You were right. This was a good test. I'm ready to go to med school. I'm getting off the road." Now I but continue to play music, but it's going to be on an occasional basis. And whenever I can find a crevice during medical school. And so I went on to medical school. But remember, I think I told you at one time that when I was in college, I met Miles Davis.
Yes, yes. I
And
was just getting ready to ask you that question.
because of the fact that I had my Miles Davis t-shirt on. Can you see?
No, because I remember you played with Miles Davis.
That's right. I didn't play with Miles Davis so much as I became taught by him. He taught me a lot of licks and he taught me a lot about life. And we became lifelong friends. And later, I became his doctor. Quite a guy. In any event, I met Miles when I was a freshman at Harvard. And there's a long story that goes along with that, which I won't try to tell. But at that time, I got a chance to meet a number of other outstanding jazz musicians, including John Coltrane, and later had a chance to sit in with Coltrane in Brooklyn, where you live, at a place called, what was that called? The Blue Coronet.
I was just getting ready to say the coordinate.
Yeah, it was on Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn.
And I live about 4 blocks down from where it was at.
Is that right?
Huh?
Yeah, the Blue Cornet. And that was one of the highlights, playing with Coltrane. But in any event, I went to medical school and continued to play music on the side as I continued my career in medicine. And I still do that. And that's been,
Now, some of the people that you played with, other than the ones you named, do I get this correctly that you at some point played with Billie Holiday?
oh, that's an interesting story. I did indeed. And that was a freakish thing. I was living with my sister in East Orange, New Jersey, and playing gigs around New York and New Jersey during that. I think that was during the year that I was out of school. And at one point, I played at this place called Teddy Powell's Lounge in Newark, New Jersey,
Yes, Teddy Powell.
with a group headed by the alto saxophonist Lou Donaldson. And Lou told us one night, he said, "Gentlemen, we're going to have a singer to join us." And most of instrumentalists don't necessarily like to play behind singers because singers use different kind of keys and really tax you. And we groaned, and he said, don't worry, you're going to like this." So we went out and played our obligatory 3 tunes to start the gig off. And then he came out and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen," to the audience, "we have a treat for you this evening. We're going to have a vocalist to join us, if you don't mind. And I don't think I need to tell you her name. You'll recognize her when she walks out." And they opened the curtains, and this lady came out with this big white gardenia in her hair. That was Billie Holiday. So that's when I had an opportunity to with Billie Holiday. I think that was 1950, because she either 55 or 56. She died in 1956, I think it was, the next year. But what an experience to be able to play behind Lady Day and sit.
When the curtains opened, how did you feel?
I said, "My God, I'm glad I decided to stay on the stage despite not liking to play behind singers." I said, "This is no ordinary singer."
Now, I remember that your mentor was Clifford Brown. Did that come later on, or was it during that particular period of time?
No, the Clifford Brown mentorship was much earlier. Um, Let me just mention that Clifford Brown, who was the greatest trumpet player in the history of jazz, was also a, not a classmate, but a contemporary of mine at Howard High School in Wilmington, Delaware. That's where he went to school and where he became my role model in music and in life, really. He's such a fantastic guy. He was three years ahead of me in high school. And so during that time, he was preparing to go off into jazz, and I got a chance to learn a lot. He took me under his wing, taught me a lot of things during that time. But he didn't live very long. He died at the age of 25 in an auto accident it was June 26, 1956. I'll never forget it, as I got a chance to talk to him. And actually, I was interviewing him for a paper that I was writing at Harvard the night before he got killed.
Oh boy. Oh
That
boy.
was really dramatic.
That shocked you and
Oh,
made
God.
you feel so sad.
Yes, so sad. But
And the other person that you talked about, Lee Morgan,
yeah,
a cafe, Nurican Cafe on, I think it's on First Avenue. Anyway, in the lower Manhattan area. And one of my friends, Rome Neal, has what he calls the banana pudding, but he's also the chairman of the board of Nurican Theater, and he's a jazz singer.
oh,
He plays instruments. And I was there one night, and then I discovered two doors down from his is where Lee Morgan was killed when his wife came and killed him.
oh, wow. Okay.
It was eerie,
Yeah.
knowing that this is where Lee Morgan was killed by his wife.
He used to call Lee Morgan Candy because he liked to eat Hershey bars and all these chocolate candies, and made his teeth bad, and he was self-conscious about that.
Mm.
We nicknamed him Candy. What an incredible talent.
Mhm.
He was from Philly and a few years younger than myself. He was another one who looked up to Clifford Brown, and we all followed him in regards to developing our trumpet playing styles at that time.
Now, I'm going to say something out of order, but I want to make sure that I get this out because we were talking about Lee Morgan. Lee Morgan has a street named after him in front of Howard High.
No, Clifford Brown does.
Clifford Brown, I'm sorry.
All right.
Clifford Brown has a street named after him in Wilmington, Delaware, right in front of the high school, where both of you all are enshrined in their Hall of Fame, right?
Correct.
Who has a street named after him perpendicular to him? Can I hear
I think I do. And I think if you were there at the time that was done, that was such a great honor. That was on June 20th of this year, just a few.
Yes, and it was a great honor being there. And then you went out and you played to the crowd in terms of the festival that was there also. So that was an honor in itself. Now, you go to medical school. Where do you go to medical school at?
In your town at the State University of New York, State Medical Center, down on Clarkson Avenue.
And again, my daughter was born at Downstate.
Wow. I might have delivered her because medical students delivered babies when we're in our third year, our clinical years.
So tell me a little bit about your experiences at Downstate.
They weren't very pleasant, very difficult. Again, I was in the minority way in the minority of students. Out of 150 students in my class at Downstate, there were only 3 of us who were Black. And I think that you might know one of the gentlemen, Jerry Dees. Jerry
Yes,
Dees.
Dr. D.
He was one of my classmates. We were very close. Jerry was a person that I depended on for knowledge of the area because I didn't know anything about Brooklyn or New York in general, coming from little town Wilmington, Delaware, and in the big old New York. So he helped me out at that time quite a bit, and I'll never forget him. Uh, but my experiences were difficult because of the fact that downstate was really a very prejudiced place. They only took in a few Black students to satisfy some of the requirements of the federal protocols so that they could continue to get federal grants. They had to have some integration going on. And the professors were very hard on us, particularly because they didn't think that we matched up to the white students who were attending there. So we, the Black students, got together and we said, we're going to show them. All of us have to do extremely well, which we all did, just to show them that we Black students were not there just by a fluke and that we belonged and we can compete with the best of them, which we did. But we had a hard way. They gave us a hard road to hoe, so to speak, as they say. And I didn't come out of there with very good feelings about that school. And for a long time, I refused to go to any of the reunions or answer any of the mail, the alumni that they sent out to the alumni and so forth. Ultimately, I did, and it was only because of the fact that they called me back to give me an honor based on some of the accomplishments that I made later on. So I said, okay, I'll agree to go back to my class reunion at that particular time. But yeah, I had a hard time at downstate. I did not like it. And it did not like me. But I got through it, struggled through, and did well, and went on to other things.
Okay. Now, what was the first other thing that you did after you left there?
Had gotten married by that time, and my wife and I were thinking about getting out of the East Coast and going somewhere else to live, or at least to go for our postgraduate training. And we were looking at California. The only thing is that everybody was looking at California. Everybody wanted to get an internship at some big hospital in California. And so I said, I don't know whether this is going to work, but I'll apply. So I applied to UC San Francisco, which was one, I think at that time was the number one hospital to apply to for internships in the country. And I was selected for an internship there. So that was the next big thing that I did. We moved west and
West, young man.
yeah, to San Francisco. And that's how I actually wound up on the West Coast.
San Francisco is expensive to live in as it is now.
Oh, it was, yes, it was. And I didn't stay there more than, I think it was 2 years, 2 years, because of the fact that I decided that I wanted to change my course in medicine. I was going to be a brain surgeon. So I started out doing a surgical internship at UC San Francisco. I decided after I began that I didn't really want to be a surgeon. I wasn't the surgical type, which I won't describe right now because I don't want to offend any of my friends who are surgeons. But I just said, this is not for me. I want to pursue something else. And my second love was the heart. So I decided that I would change horses in midstream and try to get a residency in internal medicine, which I did in Southern California at USC. So we wound up moving south to Los Angeles. And that's how I happen to be here now.
from brain surgery to heart.
Yes. Not an easy
I
job.
mean, they both hard.
Right.
You know, and they both vital
Yeah,
parts of the body. Thank goodness that you stuck in that field and became the cardiologist that you are.
thank
Uh,
you.
after becoming a cardiologist, did you consider moving out of California to someplace else?
I did, in fact, and that happened during my training in cardiology because I was selected to go back to Harvard, this time to Harvard Medical School, to do my cardiology training after I finished my internal medicine residency at USC. So I was selected to go to Brigham and Women's Hospital, which was the #1 hospital in the country, if not in the world, to do my cardiology training under Harvard Medical School. And so I moved back to the East Coast from the West Coast to pursue my cardiology training. And once I finished all of that training, my wife didn't want to stay in Boston. She hated Boston. And so I was essentially forced to move back to the West Coast and came back to Los Angeles.
During that time, but that you were in Boston, were you, did you become friends with some of the players on the Boston Celtics like Bill Russell?
No way. No, I wish I could have. Uh,
And
but in fact, I was a fan of the Celtics at that time. Uh, Later became a fan of the Lakers, which
of
uh,
course.
some made me an enemy of the Celtics. But no, I didn't have opportunity to meet those guys. I wish I had. I admired them, and I had a chance to go to a few Celtics games.
But they should have sought you out because you were, yeah, they were playing basketball, and it does have some relationships with how we as Black folks have moved forward. But a doctor, a cardiologist, somebody to save your life.
But you're right on point with that because later on in my cardiology career, I became aware of the fact that there was this phenomenon that was occurring, sudden cardiac death in athletes. And
Mhm.
most of the athletes, or a disproportionate number of the athletes that were dying, were Black. And a disproportionate number of them were basketball players. And so I decided to pursue some research in that area. And I did a lot of intensive research and wound up writing a book. I wish I had that book here to show you, but in any event, it was called The Athlete and Heart Disease and became pretty prominent now as the #1 book looking at this phenomenon of sudden cardiac death in Blacks, which we eventually characterized as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. That's a long term just to define the muscular, cardiac muscular abnormality that occurs that leads to this sudden death phenomenon. But in any event, that was something that I pursued for a while to the point where I got some attention from athletic conferences and from eventually from the NBA Players Association because there was a lot of concern about whether or not there should be some stricter protocols looking at athletes entering into vigorous sports like that. And in fact, there was cardiovascular agency, so to speak, that was created to look at that very critically. And I was part of that. So, make a long story short, I got a call one day from the head of the NBA Players Association. They said, we'd like for you to come to Chicago and talk to us about this specter of sudden cardiac death occurring in Black athletes and particularly in basketball players and give us some heads up on what's going on. So I agreed to go and there I was in the midst of all these fantastic players. I mean, I was just, it was just an incredible thing. I remember that at that time, there was a game being played by, I think it was the Knicks against the Bulls in Chicago. And what's the name of the player? The developed kidney disease and had to leave the game. Zoe,
I remember it, but
you know, I'm talking about, yeah, a big, tall forward. And I got a chance to meet him and talk to him. The bottom line was that they were very suspicious about this because the coaches didn't want the players to be examined too closely for fear that something might be discovered in their star players that might disqualify them from being able to play. And I refer to people like Reggie Lewis, who died with the Boston Celtics, and Hank Gathers, who was in college, who was the first person of note who died from that disease. And all those guys I had studied very closely, as well as other athletes. But in any event, they wanted to make sure that nothing was going to occur that would disqualify their athletes. And I said, wait, you need to be more concerned about these athletes' lives than about the money that may not be going into your pockets if they have to drop off the team or out of basketball. But they thanked me very much for my expertise and information and went right on in their merry way. They never really gave full consideration to the problem that still faces a lot of athletes. And every once in a while, something pops up where an athlete dies of sudden cardiac arrest. And everybody says, oh, we should have pursued this more vigorously before and protected our athletes by doing the proper uh, examinations before they played and so forth. But they're not really serious about that.
yeah, it reminds me of and why I say that, yeah, athletics are good, but it's, you remember the Godfather, Don Corleone, telling his son who was in college, he told his son, you get, you don't keep the same roommate for 4 years. You get somebody that's in medicine, you get somebody that's a lawyer, that's going to be in law, somebody's going to be accountant, because they're your friends for the rest of your life. Look after you much better.
Very true.
Now, tell me about your experience as, number one, creating the Association of Black Cardiologists. What prompted you to do that?
That all started back at the time that I was going through my cardiology training at Harvard. First of all, I looked around and found that there was nobody Black in any of the Boston hospitals, including all of the Harvard hospitals. Harvard controls 20 hospitals in Boston. And then there's Tufts and there's Boston University. They control all the rest of them. No, none of them had ever had any Black postgraduate trainees, that is, interns, residents, fellows, training in any field of medicine. Did you hear me?
Mm.
Nobody Black by the time that I got there to Boston. So as I looked around, I said, something's wrong with this picture, and it needs to change. And so I talked to a lot of people in and outside of medicine in Boston. And I decided that something that needed to be done was to start a movement to recruit more Black or some Blacks into medical fields in Boston hospitals and into the medical schools, because medical schools had very few Black students as it was. And as I said, no postgraduate trainees. After you finish medical school, you go on to internship and residency and so forth. They had never had anybody, never in their entire history, which goes back hundreds of years. So anyway, I started this movement and we got together with some very interesting people named the Black Panthers and the Muslims and a number of other people who joined me in fighting this. We took a petition to Harvard Medical School, and I think it scared the bejesus out of them that something revolutionary was going to happen. I was scared because I thought they're going to throw me out of my fellowship, out of my training, for starting a revolution or something. So I'm telling you all of this as a lead up to what began the ABC. I realized that at that time that unless we did something to look at our own health care, and especially our cardiovascular care, nobody was going to do anything for us. We had to take our own health into our own hands and treat ourselves. We had to develop our own doctors and develop our own approach to medicine, to the patient, because Black people should not be lumped into a category with everybody else. We have different needs and manifestations and so on and so forth, which I wrote a whole book about. But in any event, as I went forward with my training, everywhere I turned to talk to white doctors, white cardiologists, I was told Black folks don't have any problems with heart attacks. Literally. Now, I was in training in 1968, and that's not that long ago, really. But we were told that hypertension was not a problem, that heart attacks did not regularly occur as Dr. Paul Dudley White told me, in the purebred Negro, and that we should spend our time focusing on other problems of Black health rather than heart disease. Now, this is at a time when I'm in a hospital which sits in Roxbury, that is Brigham Hospital, and seeing all these Black patients coming through with heart attacks and being shunted off sent home because the doctors, the trainees have been told that can't be a heart attack. There must be an upset stomach and gas or gas pains the patient's having and something like that. And they go home and die. So I just decided something had to be done about that to marshal more information, correct information about our folks. And I had an opportunity when I went to the American Heart Association convention in Dallas, Texas in 1974. I'd already developed the ideas of an organization of Black cardiologists in my mind up to that point. But when I went there, I noticed there weren't that many Blacks attending. I could only identify about 12 or 15 Black, either in training in cardiology or who were established cardiologists by that time. That's in the whole country. And that's out of a population of well over 150,000 cardiologists. So that was when I I got all of the Blacks that I could find at that convention together. And I said, we need to form an organization for us and for our people. And I told them why. And they said, right on, let's get started with it. So that's when I founded the Association of Black Cardiologists, calling it the ABC.
Congratulations.
Rest is history.
I had the privilege of attending at least two, I think it was two or three, but I know I did attend one of your conventions because at the time, Wayne Kahn was your president, CEO.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I sat at his table and it was right across from your table.
Okay. I was president at that time.
Yes, he was president at that time. In at today's, we fast forward to 2024. How are things different from when you founded it to now? And
Vastly
what are
different.
your needs? What are the ABC's needs now, as opposed to there they needed everything? I'm sure.
So
But
bear in mind that we're now 50 years past our founding. This is
mhm,
our 50th anniversary of the ABC. This year, 2024, we were founded. I founded the organization in 1974, as I mentioned, in Dallas, Texas. So we just finished celebrating our 50th anniversary with a gala a couple of weeks ago here in LA. And we're going to have another gala next year, uh, carrying on our celebratory activities into 2025. To answer your question about how things have changed, first of all, that 12 or 15 number of Black cardiologists that existed in 1974 has now expanded to almost 1,000 Black cardiologists that we have. Still not enough, but way past where we were. And that is a principal change because we have recruited youngsters into cardiology who may not have thought that there was even a possibility of getting into that vaunted field before. We gave them the encouragement. We provided encouragement, we provided scholarships, we provided incentive for them to go into cardiology, and they have responded. So we've got some of the best cardiologists in the world now here in the United States who are Black and who are taking care of not only our people, but all people. So we have made tremendous strides in regards to Black health, cardiovascular health. We have revealed the fact that Blacks have actually, in fact, more heart disease than whites do. And I'm not going to try to quote all the statistics, but we have more heart attacks. We have a great amount of heart failure. We have more strokes. We have more kidney disease, kidney failure, and so forth. And, and so we had been told lies all of those years just to put us off so that we wouldn't be constantly coming back to the white folks and saying, we need some help. They were shunning us off like we didn't matter. And indeed, we didn't matter to them. But now we know that Black lives matter, and we're making it visible and evident to everybody. And we have been doing that for 50 years, and Lord willing, we'll continue that for at least another 50 years and beyond.
and Lord willing, you'll be here for another 50 years, right?
I don't know about that. I don't know how I'll look at that.
How did this meld with your other founding other institution that you founded, the Minority Health Institute?
Oh, wow. You're right on it. Looking at things 10 years in to after I founded ABC, I realized that this couldn't be a movement that should be restricted just to heart disease, that we have to be considering all illness, all disease as it affects Blacks, and do everything that we could to help out in all fields of medicine. The ABC was not doing that. ABC was focusing, as it should, on heart disease, which is the number one killer of all of us. And that was appropriate, but we couldn't leave all of the other problems untouched, unrecognized. And so I started this group called the Minority Health Institute to focus on not only illness and disease in minority populations, and particularly in Blacks, but also to emphasize the need for a specialized type of education of the people that are going to be taking care of us. Because as I said, Black people have different needs, different manifestations of disease, etc., as I gave evidence of in my textbook of Black-related diseases, which I wrote in 1970. And we can't expect that other people are going to pay the proper attention to that. And and also we have to make sure that Black doctors are well trained, properly trained to take care of Black people. And so that has been the thrust of the Minority Health Institute, MHI. We've had a number of seminars and symposia over the past 40 years that we've been in existence. And we're about to have another one in December, on December 13th. That's the one that was postponed from the time that you were expected to come out. And this will be a huge symposium and gala all in the same day to focus on health problems of Blacks and other minorities. And we expect to get outstanding sponsorship and support for this to be able to carry on our activities in support of Black health.
Fantastic, fantastic. And as I mentioned at the very opening, I did tell our audience that you also served as the 117th president of the National Medical Association, and we appreciate that so much. Is there anything that you would like to close with? You talked about so much, but is there anything that you would like to close with to my audience?
Yes, and also to you. You might say that I've done a lot in my career and accomplished a great deal and so forth. But none of what I've done is going to make any difference if people like you don't recognize it and point out to other folks the importance of what we've tried to do. It's all going to fall on deaf ears. It's not going to get through. It's not going to make any difference. So thank you for what you do in trying to promote what we do. And hopefully that will continue and you'll be able to spread the word even wider than it is right now.
This was a fantastic show. Thank you so much for being on it.
Thank you.
And that's it for the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. See you next week.
Thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed this show about stuff. See you next time.